This next lecture is going to be on the autonomic nervous system. So, if you remember, when we think of the motor portion of the nervous system, we divided it into somatic and autonomic. So, somatic went to skeletal muscle, and autonomic were nerves that went to other muscle like smooth or cardiac or even glands. That's what we're going to be talking about now. That's the autonomic nervous system. So, starting with just a little background, this generally operates without conscious control. It helps maintain a state of balance in the body called homeostasis, and it's regulated by the brain, so within the hypothalamus and the brainstem. So comparing the somatic versus the autonomic, so somatic nervous system, there's one motor neuron that leaves the spinal cord, goes out to skeletal muscle. If you look over here on the autonomic side, there's not one but two motor neurons. So you have this one that leaves the spinal cord, and then it's going to synapse with a second one that goes to the organ. In this case, it's the lungs. So generally we call this first one the presynaptic neuron or preganglionic neuron, and then this is the postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron. It's called pre and postganglionic because where they synapse is a ganglia or ganglion. All right, comparing pre and postganglionic neurons. So the preganglionic versus the postganglionic. Preganglionic is always going to release acetylcholine for the neurotransmitter. And they're also always going to be myelinated. Even though the myelin's not shown in this picture, preganglionic neurons are myelinated. Postganglionic neurons can release either acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter or sometimes norepinephrine, depending on something we'll talk about later. And the postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into two branches. So one is called sympathetic, the other is called parasympathetic. And we'll briefly discuss each and talk about some anatomical and functional differences. Many organs are innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, meaning they're dually innervated. So if we look at the parasympathetic first, it's also known as the craniosacral division, sometimes called the resting and digesting branch. So the reason it's called craniosacral is you can see the nerves that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system leave the central nervous system as either a cranial nerve or coming off the sacral region of the spinal cord. It's called the resting and digesting branch because generally the parasympathetic nervous system is operating to slow things down and bring things back to a resting state. For instance, if you take your heart rate, it will lower your heart rate. It's very active after you've just eaten, and it helps you digest food, so that's where the digesting comes in. So resting and digesting branch. So this would be really active while you're sleeping. And anatomically, there's a long preganglionic neuron and a very short postganglionic neuron. Thus, the ganglia where they synapse is always going to be close to the organ. Another picture, see the long myelinated preganglionic neuron, short unmyelinated postganglionic neuron. All right, so the ganglia of that where the pre and postganglionic neurons synapse, they can be divided into two types. Sometimes the ganglia are within the organ itself, and we call those intramural ganglia. And sometimes they're out here. They're just out in other parts of the body, and those are just called terminal ganglia. It's still close to the organ, but it's not within it. All right, and then, like I said, the outflow is coming from the cranial nerves or the sacral nerves. All right, the sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, or sympathetic branch, is called the thoracolumbar division because it comes off the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. It's also known as the fight or flight system. And because it's active under stressful conditions, so when you're scared or you're exercising, that's when this branch would be really active. So it's the opposite of the parasympathetic as it has a short preganglionic neuron, and thus the ganglia are going to be closer to the spinal cord. So you see short, myelinated, preganglionic, long, unmyelinated, postganglionic. And you can see where a lot of these sympathetic neurons are synapsing. It's right next to the spinal cord. And this is what we alluded to earlier in the lab model, that this is the sympathetic chain ganglia. So the sympathetic ganglia, there's two major different types. So we have the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is sometimes called the sympathetic trunk ganglia, sometimes called paravertebral, but most people call it the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then sometimes there's ganglia out here, away from the spinal cord a little bit. Those would be prevertebral or collateral ganglia. So talking about the sympathetic branch, this is where those Ramey communicants come in. So I'm going to show you a picture, then we'll go back and look at that. But if you just kind of follow this, so you get a preganglionic neuron leaving the spinal cord, is coming, it's going to go into those Ramey communicants that we talked about, that were part of the anterior ramus of a spinal nerve. So this branch that it goes through first is going to be called the white Ramey communicant. And then if it goes back through the other one, that one's called a gray Ramey communicant. So if you look here, you might be able to see it a little bit better. So the preganglionic goes through the white, then it can synapse with a postganglionic neuron, which sometimes will go back through the gray. So where do the terms white and gray come from? It's easy when you think about it, because you remember the preganglionic neuron was myelinated, so this one is always going to be white. And then the postganglionic, whether or not it goes through here or not, this one was called the gray Ramey communicant because there is no myelin there. So going back to this, white Ramey communicants connect the anterior rami with the sympathetic trunk ganglia. So that's what you're seeing here. This is your sympathetic chain ganglia or sympathetic trunk ganglia. Here's your preganglionic neuron. It's coming here and synapsing there. And then the gray Ramey communicant, so let's follow this one. The postganglionic fibers connect the sympathetic trunk ganglion back to the spinal nerves. So that would be in this example here where this postganglionic is going back through the gray and then it's going to go somewhere else. So key point, if you look right here, this is always the white Ramey communicant or white ramus. This one's always the gray because this one has myelin, this one does not. All right, so what are our options here as far as what goes on in the sympathetic chain ganglia? Well, the most common thing is this. So you'll get the preganglionic going through the white Ramey communicant, synapsing with a postganglionic neuron that goes back through the gray and then out to somewhere in the body. You can also get something like this. White does it, the preganglionic does the same thing it did before, but this time it's synapsing to a post, and the postganglionic neuron just kind of breaks out and it does not go back through the gray. In this example, this is what a lot of nerves that go to the intestines do. The preganglionic neuron goes through the white ramus, continues on, goes through the sympathetic chain ganglia without synapsing, and then synapses at one of those prevertebral ganglia elsewhere in the body, and the postganglionic goes to the intestines. This is called the splanchnic nerve pathway. So it doesn't synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia, but it synapses at another ganglia. And then lastly, we have what's called the adrenal medulla pathway, and this is specific to a gland called the adrenal gland. There's the middle part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla, and the preganglionic neuron runs all the way to it without ever synapsing to a postganglionic neuron. So in this pathway, there is no postganglionic neuron. So those are four big options that you have with these sympathetic nerves. All right, the last thing I'm going to cover is the neurotransmitters. So there's a lot of text here, but I think I can sum it up really quick and then we can go back and look at the text. Parasympathetic nerves or neurons, preganglionic parasympathetic neurons always release always release acetylcholine. Same for sympathetic preganglionic neurons. So as a key point, all preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. With the postganglionic neurons, it really depends on if you're in this parasympathetic or sympathetic. So Postganglionic parasympathetic neurons still release acetylcholine. Most sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine. So I say most because there is an exception. So most postganglionic sympathetic neurons secrete norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter. In one case, specifically the postganglionic sympathetic nerves going to sweat glands, they actually also secrete acetylcholine. So that's kind of the exception to the rule. So postganglionic sympathetic neurons going to sweat glands still release acetylcholine, but most postganglionic sympathetic neurons secrete norepinephrine. So that's what this was all about. So cholinergic neurons release acetylcholine. That includes all preganglionic, all parasympathetic postganglionic, and then sympathetic postganglionic going to sweat glands. The receptors that respond to acetylcholine can be classified as either nicotinic or muscarinic, and you can see differences there. If nicotinic, it's always going to get excited. Muscarinic, it could be either or. This isn't a huge deal. And then as far as the adrenergic neurons secrete norepinephrine, so that would include most sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And the adrenergic receptors that respond to norepinephrine can be classified as alpha or beta, and then there's different subtypes. So whether you get excitation or inhibition really depends on the receptor subtype. So you may be wondering where this term adrenergic comes from. Another name for epinephrine is adrenaline. And so norepinephrine is also known as noradrenaline. And so you can associate this term adrenergic or adrenaline with norepinephrine that way.